It was the summer of 2023 when my friends and I decided to embark on a much-needed vacation. We were tired of our monotonous routines, so we thought a weekend getaway to a remote cabin nestled deep within the woods would provide the perfect escape. Little did we know our Airbnb booking would turn into a nightmare we'd never forget. The cabin, known as Hillside Retreat, looked like something out of a postcard. It was perched on the edge of a tranquil lake, surrounded by dense woods that stretched as far as the eye could see. The pictures on the Airbnb listing had shown a picturesque paradise, and the price was almost too good to be true. My friends, Sarah, Mike, and I arrived at Hillside Retreat on a warm Friday afternoon. The cabin was even more stunning in person. It had a rustic charm with a large stone fireplace, a cozy living area, and a kitchen stocked with all the essentials. The lake outside sparkled in the sunlight, and it felt like we had stepped into our own private slice of heaven. As evening approached, we settled in and decided to explore the surroundings. The forest was dense, and the path to the lake seemed to go on forever. There was something eerie about the woods, though we dismissed it as a trick of our imagination. We were on vacation, after all, and our senses were heightened by the unfamiliar surroundings. Our first night at Hillside Retreat was peaceful. We gathered around the fireplace, shared stories, and enjoyed a few drinks. It was the perfect way to unwind. As we lay in our beds that night, I could hear the wind rustling through the leaves and the faint chirping of crickets outside. It was the kind of serenity that city life never offered. The next morning, Sarah woke us up with excitement in her eyes. "Guys, there's a hiking trail nearby. Let's explore it today," she exclaimed. Mike and I agreed, and soon we were making our way through the dense woods. The trail led deeper into the forest, and it wasn't long before we realized that we had lost our way. Panic began to set in as the trees closed in around us, and every direction seemed the same. We tried retracing our steps, but the path seemed to have vanished. Hours passed, and desperation grew. We couldn't find our way back to Hillside Retreat, and our cell phones had no signal. The sun was setting, and we were lost in the heart of the woods. Just when despair was about to consume us, we stumbled upon a clearing in the forest. There, in the middle of nowhere, stood an old, decrepit house. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, with shattered windows and rotting wood. But we didn't care. We needed shelter for the night. Inside, the house was in a state of disarray. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and dust covered everything. We found an old mattress in one of the rooms and decided to spend the night there. It was far from comfortable, but it was better than being alone in the dark woods. As the night deepened, strange things began to happen. We heard footsteps in the hallway outside the room, and eerie whispers filled the air. I couldn't help but feel that we were not alone in the house. Mike was convinced it was just our imagination playing tricks on us, but Sarah and I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Then, just before dawn, we heard it. A blood-curdling scream that echoed through the house. We rushed out of the room and found Mike standing in the hallway, pale as a ghost. He pointed toward a nearby window, and our hearts sank. Outside the window, we saw a shadowy figure standing by a tree, its eyes reflecting the moonlight with an unnatural crimson glow. It was a sight that sent shivers down our spines. Without a word, we knew we had to get out of that house. We made a run for it, leaving the old, haunted house behind. Somehow, we managed to find our way back to Hillside Retreat, and when we arrived, the sun had just begun to rise. We were exhausted, terrified, and covered in dirt, but we were alive. We decided to cut our vacation short and packed our things hastily. As we left the cabin, I couldn't help but glance back one last time at the serene lake and the cabin that had turned into a house of horrors. Back home, we couldn't shake off the fear that had engulfed us. We never spoke about the cabin in the woods again, hoping that time would erase the memories, but it didn't. Months passed, and strange occurrences started happening in our lives. We'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, feeling a presence in the room. Whispers followed us, and shadows danced in the corners of our vision. It was as if something had latched onto us, something from that forsaken house in the woods. Desperate for answers, we decided to investigate the history of Hillside Retreat. What we discovered sent chills down our spines. The house we had stumbled upon in the woods was once a thriving family home. However, it had been abandoned decades ago after a series of mysterious deaths and disappearances. We couldn't deny it any longer. We were haunted by the malevolent spirit of that house. We tried everything to rid ourselves of it: psychics, priests, and even paranormal investigators. But nothing worked. The spirit seemed to feed on our fear and misery, growing stronger with each passing day. Our lives had become a living nightmare. The whispers turned into agonizing screams that echoed in our minds day and night. Shadows reached out for us, and we could feel icy fingers brushing against our skin. We had to do something, or we would be driven to madness. One fateful night, as we huddled together in fear, we made a decision. We would return to the house in the woods and confront the spirit once and for all. Armed with every ounce of courage we could muster, we made the journey back. As we stood before the old house, the same crimson-eyed figure appeared, but this time, it was more real than ever. It lunged at us, a howling, twisted specter that defied all logic. We fought back with every ounce of strength, reciting prayers and banishment rituals we had learned. The battle was intense, and the house seemed to come alive with malevolent energy. But slowly, as dawn approached, the spirit weakened. With a final scream, it dissipated into nothingness, leaving us shaken but victorious. We left the house, never to return, and the darkness that had plagued our lives finally lifted. We may have defeated the spirit, but the scars it left on our souls remained. To this day, I can't help but wonder about Hillside Retreat and the true horrors that lurk beneath its serene facade. It serves as a chilling reminder that some Airbnb listings may offer more than just a peaceful getaway. They may harbor secrets that can haunt you for the rest of your life. I'll tell you about the Airbnb experience I had a couple of years ago. It was supposed to be a relaxing vacation in a quaint, remote cabin nestled deep within the woods. Little did I know, it would turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. The cabin was a picture-perfect escape, with its rustic charm and secluded location. It was situated on the edge of a dense forest, far away from any signs of civilization. I had always craved some solitude, and this seemed like the ideal place to find it. Upon arriving, I was struck by the eerie beauty of the surroundings. The trees loomed tall and ancient, their branches reaching out to form a natural canopy overhead. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and a soft breeze rustled the leaves, creating an almost hypnotic symphony. The cabin itself was cozy, with a warm fireplace and a charming kitchen. It had all the amenities one could need for a weekend getaway, and I was thrilled to be away from the hustle and bustle of city life. The first evening went smoothly. I spent my time exploring the woods, taking long walks, and breathing in the serenity of the place. As night fell, I lit a fire and curled up with a book. The soft crackling of the firewood was the only sound, and it was incredibly soothing. However, on the second night, things took a turn for the worse. I had settled into bed early, still feeling tired from my daytime adventures. Just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard it, a faint, distant whisper. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination playing tricks on me. But then it came again, unmistakable and chilling. I strained my ears trying to make out the words. It was as if someone was speaking in hushed tones, just beyond the walls of the cabin. My heart began to race as I realized that I was alone in the middle of the woods, and there should be no one else around for miles. Carefully, I climbed out of bed and tiptoed to the window. The moonlight spilled through the curtains, casting eerie shadows on the floor. I peered outside, but there was nothing to see, just the impenetrable darkness of the forest. The whispering continued, and it seemed to grow louder. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Anxiety, fear, and desperation. Panic gripped me as I realized that the voices were not coming from outside the cabin, but from within its walls. I began to search every room, turning on lights and checking under beds and inside closets, but there was no one there. The voices persisted, echoing through the cabin's wooden structure. I felt like I was losing my mind. Terrified and unsure of what to do, I grabbed my phone and tried to call the Airbnb host. But to my horror, there was no signal. I was completely cut off from the outside world, alone with these haunting whispers. As the night wore on, the voices seemed to multiply, filling the cabin with their eerie chorus. I sat on the floor, my back against the wall, trying to drown them out with my own thoughts. It felt like an eternity before the first rays of dawn broke through the windows. Exhausted and terrified, I ventured outside to escape the relentless voices. The forest that had seemed so peaceful just days before now felt menacing and oppressive. I walked for hours, not knowing where I was going, until I stumbled upon a dilapidated cabin deep in the woods. Against my better judgment, I pushed the creaky door open and stepped inside. The interior was dark and the air was thick with the same oppressive atmosphere that had plagued my own cabin. I searched the rooms, my heart pounding in my chest, and then I found it, the source of the whispers. In the corner of one room, there was a dusty old phonograph, its needle scratching against an ancient record. The voices that had haunted me were emanating from this forgotten relic. I quickly turned it off, and the silence that followed was deafening. As I left the abandoned cabin and made my way back to my own, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees reaching out with their gnarled branches like skeletal fingers. When I finally returned to my cabin, I packed my belongings in a frenzy and fled, leaving the haunting whispers behind. To this day, I have no explanation for what I experienced in that remote Airbnb cabin. It was a true nightmare, and I can only hope that I'll never encounter anything like it again. So if you ever find yourself considering a secluded Airbnb in the woods, remember my story. Sometimes, the solitude you seek can turn into a horrifying ordeal, and the true horror may be lurking just beyond the walls of your supposed sanctuary. My name is Alex, and I have always been a sucker for adrenaline-pumping experiences. So when my friends decided to spend a weekend in the remote Whispering Pines cottage, I couldn't resist the opportunity. Little did I know this trip would become the source of one of the most terrifying Airbnb horror stories ever. As we arrived at Whispering Pines Cottage, I was struck by its eerie beauty. Surrounded by dense woods and shrouded in mist, it stood alone, far from civilization. The Airbnb listing had mentioned that the cottage was secluded, but I didn't expect it to be this isolated. Our group consisted of me, my best friend Sarah, her boyfriend Mark, and another couple, Lisa and Mike. The moment we stepped out of our cars, a shiver ran down my spine. The air was heavy with an unsettling silence, and the whispers of the swaying pines seemed to echo the cottage's ominous name. Inside the cottage, the atmosphere was equally unsettling. The place was rustic, with old wooden furniture, dimly lit by antique lamps. Dusty portraits adorned the walls, staring at us with eyes that felt too real for comfort. The Airbnb host, a friendly woman named Mrs. Johnson, had left us a note welcoming us to the cottage and explaining a few things about the property. She mentioned that the cottage had a rich history, and some guests had reported strange occurrences, like whispers in the night and shadows moving on their own. We all laughed it off as an attempt to set the mood for our Halloween weekend. Our first night at Whispering Pines was calm, despite the eeriness of the place. We shared ghost stories, played card games, and indulged in spooky movies. As the clock struck midnight, the group decided to call it a night. Sarah and I were given the attic room, while the other couple took the room adjacent to ours. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me as I climbed into the creaky attic bed. The room was bathed in moonlight, casting eerie shadows across the walls. I brushed it off as my overactive imagination and closed my eyes. Suddenly, I was jolted awake by the sound of faint whispers. I strained my ears, trying to make out the words. It was as if someone was having a hushed conversation just outside our door. I nudged Sarah awake. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. She groggily replied, "Hear what?" I decided not to wake the others, thinking it might be just the wind or some animals outside. But I couldn't ignore the unease that had settled in my stomach. The next morning over breakfast, I brought up the whispers from the night before. To my surprise, everyone claimed they had heard nothing. I started to doubt my own sanity. Determined to put it behind me, we spent the day exploring the woods surrounding the cottage. The forest was dense, and the further we ventured, the thicker the fog became. It was as if the forest itself was trying to keep us away. At one point, Lisa stumbled upon an old, dilapidated well. Its depths seemed to swallow all sound, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it hid a dark secret. As the sun dipped below the horizon, we returned to the cottage. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. This time, Sarah heard them too. We both lay in our beds, wide awake, listening to the eerie conversation that seemed to be happening just outside our door. Unable to take it any longer, I got up and tiptoed to the door, determined to catch whoever was tormenting us. As I reached for the doorknob, the whispers suddenly stopped. I flung open the door, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, bathed in the faint glow of the antique lamps. I returned to bed, my heart pounding. Sarah and I decided not to mention it to the others, fearing they would think we were losing our minds. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, wide awake, waiting for dawn. The following morning, we were all on edge. No one mentioned the whispers from the previous night, but the tension in the cottage was palpable. We decided to pack up and leave, despite the fact that our reservation wasn't over yet. The place had become too unsettling to stay any longer. As we loaded our cars, I couldn't help but glance back at the cottage. It stood there, silent and foreboding, as if it were mocking our fear. Just then, I noticed something odd, a figure in one of the attic windows. It was a woman, her face obscured by long, dark hair. She stared at us with piercing, cold eyes. I pointed it out to the others, and we all froze, staring at the window in horror. None of us had been in the attic that morning, and there should have been no one there. In a panic, we rushed back into the cottage, determined to confront whoever was inside. But when we reached the attic, it was empty. The room was just as we had left it, untouched by any human presence. The window was open, and the cold wind whistled through the room, sending a chill down our spines. We searched every inch of the cottage, but there was no sign of the mysterious woman. Mrs. Johnson had mentioned nothing about a previous guest or a caretaker who might have been staying there. It was as if the figure in the attic had never existed. Terrified and shaken, we decided to leave the cottage immediately. We didn't care about the money we had spent. We just wanted to put as much distance between ourselves and that haunted place as possible. As we drove away from Whispering Pines Cottage, I couldn't help but wonder about the history Mrs. Johnson had mentioned. Who was the woman in the attic, and what did she want? The whispers, the strange occurrences, and that unsettling figure would forever haunt my dreams. Whispering Pines Cottage remains one of the scariest Airbnb experiences I've ever had. Whether it was a ghostly presence or something more sinister, I may never know. But one thing is for sure, I will never forget the true Airbnb horror story of that remote haunted cottage in the woods.